Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to Populist Podcast. I'm Chase,
I'm Charles.
and today we're joined by Libertarian presidential nominee Dr. Jo Jorgensen. Thanks for coming on today.
Oh, great to be here. Thanks.
All right, I'm going to get started. Do you want to go ahead and tell us who you are, where you come from, and why you're running?
Sure. Again, I'm Dr. Jo Jorgensen. I teach at Clemson University. I do not have a background in politics, in raising taxes or taking away people's rights, which is why I'm running. When people ask me why I'm running, I tell them it's because government is too big, too bossy, too nosy, too intrusive, and usually hurts those that it tries to help.
All right, so I'm going to jump right into the policy specifics. On your website, you state that you would use your constitutional authority to block any new federal borrowing that would lead to an increased deficit. How would a Jorgensen administration handle a hypothetical crisis akin to the current global pandemic without accruing any national debt?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't put everybody under house arrest so they couldn't go out and work. Under my administration, I would get rid of the obstacles in the FDA that would allow testing. There were widely reported stories about how Asian countries were able to widely test their citizens, and yet we couldn't test ours. Out of 60 companies or so in America making testing kits, the FDA only approved 2 of them. Meanwhile, the rest of the testing kits, they went around the rest of the world. So I wouldn't have done that. And unlike President Trump, who said you should only get tested if you have symptoms, even though many people with the virus didn't have symptoms at all, I would say everybody should get tested so that you can see if you need to stay home or not. You mentioned the economic crisis. Part of the economic crisis is politicians who are borrowing money so that they can pay off their special interests, because a lot of this money is going to the large corporations. And we've been hearing about how they need to bail out the airlines because we need air traffic. Well, the airplanes aren't going to disappear overnight. Maybe the people who ran the airline industry before, the airline companies, maybe they didn't do a good enough job to still run them afterwards. But regardless, we have the planes. Somebody will run them.
All right, so you stated your stance on climate change is to quote unquote reduce government barriers that make it harder to replace coal and oil burning power plants with nuclear power plants. I have 2 questions about this. One, which laws specifically do you think make it more difficult for nuclear power plants to be built? And 2, what is your plan to have enough non-carbon emitting energy sources to meet the 2030 deadline of cutting half the emissions from 2010?
Yeah, well, there are a lot of NRC laws, but the biggest problem isn't the laws, it's the handouts. So, what happens is the government comes in and they subsidize companies. And of course, they're subsidizing their special interests and their buddies. And the nuclear power field, they are the ones who are getting less of the subsidies. So basically, the government is giving more money to all of their competitors, and then they're asked to compete against them. So what I would do is I would have a level playing field and let everybody compete. And then let's see how well the people do. So nuclear power would do so much better if it didn't have to compete against government handouts. I mean, imagine if you run, I don't know, a grocery store, and imagine the government uh, starts giving a bunch of money to your competitor, to the grocery store against town. How easy is it going to be for you to compete with the other grocery store when the other grocery store is getting a bunch of money from the government?
All right, so just to follow up on that, will there be governmental oversight on these plants?
Well, of course, especially in the beginning, we would have we would make sure that there would be some safety regulations in there. But the most important thing is to let the free market compete. And a lot of people, when they hear nuclear power, they get a little worried. They think about the meltdowns in the past. But that, first of all, was old technology. And also, that was the government picking the winners and choosers. And the analogy I like to give is to give a computer analogy. So let's say we've got Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and IBM. We've got all these people coming out with their different computer systems. And what if the government came along and said, okay, Bill Gates, you win. Steve Jobs, you can go home. We don't need your computers. Well, we wouldn't have gotten nearly as far with computers. In fact, part of the reason we had the iPhone and such sophisticated laptops is that Bill Gates and Steve Jobs hated each other and they tried to outdo one another. And that's what I'd like to see in the advanced technology or the newer technology with nuclear power. And that's what's happening. There are several different companies offering uh, different products. Even Rolls Royce, who produces luxury cars, even they've developed a nuclear reactor that's 1/10 the size of the original one. And so let's let them continue to work hard for our business instead of the government just saying, okay, we're going with this one, and then not having any competition to keep them in check.
All right, so moving on to another policy that you have on your website. You've cited the years 1959 to 1969 for the relative success in cutting poverty, despite doing, quote, little to address poverty. During this decade, however, the top marginal tax rate never dipped below 70% and reached as high as 91%.
Mhm.
Furthermore, you stated that the war on poverty was implemented in the early 70s. However, it was Lyndon B. Johnson who initiated this plan in his 1964 State of the Union address, and that same year we saw the enactment of the Food Stamps Act, followed by the Social Security Act the following year. Do you
Mhm.
think this might be a misleading way to characterize poverty and the effectiveness of welfare programs?
Yeah, no, because first of all, when the politician gives a speech, nothing's been done yet. Everything moves through the government slowly. Everything moves through Congress slowly. And so, sure, some of the programs were enacted earlier, but if you look at the totality, most of them weren't actually put into law until even the late 60s. And then once they have it in law, now they've got to set up the regulations, they've got to fund them, they've got to figure out who to give it to. And by the time that they're actually giving the money to people, that can be years because government acts really slowly. I mean, all you have to do is look at FEMA and how they react to disasters. In fact, gosh, Hurricane Katrina, there were people out there helping each other in no time. And then the federal government came along later on and then sent everybody home. And what was tragic was we had people who were still trying to help, and the government kept saying, no, you're getting in the way.
All right. So on your website, you've made it clear that you support getting rid of any quote unquote arbitrary quotas that would make it harder for people to come into this country. In this vein, do you think that the US should continue to build a fence in sections of a wall across the Mexican border?
No, absolutely not. A lot of people don't realize that we basically had open immigration until the 1920s. In fact, three of my grandparents are immigrants to this country, and they came over during the teens, the 19 teens, before immigration was closed down. And we got a lot of hardworking Americans. We got a lot added to our culture, and there's no reason to think we would see anything differently now. And, one of the complaints that people have is, well, they're just coming over here for welfare. But they don't realize that a lot of the welfare programs we have require them to live in the country often for 5 years before they start collecting. And so I think what we're seeing are hardworking Americans. And if you look at the numbers, we actually come out economically ahead by having immigrants move in.
All right, so again, taking a look at your policy proposal page, you referenced a study that claims we could lower healthcare spending by 75% by encouraging competition. Now, this percentage refers to a study by Associate Economics Professor Sean Masaki Flynn. The article in question advocates for the Singaporean healthcare system, which uses what is called a medical savings account.
Mhm.
In Singapore specifically, workers mandatorily invest up to 37% of their wages into this account to cover their expenses. Seeing as how you reference this study to characterize your commitment to private sector healthcare, would you advocate for this system? And if so, how does this differ from the lack of choice associated with paying a tax to fund public healthcare?
Well, that would be one program, and let me point out, this has actually been done in the United States. The state of Indiana implemented a similar system in which people were given the choice. Do you want this health savings account type of thing? or do you want to stay on the old insurance? And at first, people were hesitant, but and it's kind of funny because the first year hardly anybody signed up. But then when they told their friends how great it was, then in a year or two, uh, over half the people had signed up. And what happened was the government actually funded their health savings account. So it wasn't like they were going to be left without any money to pay for hospital bills. They actually put the money in there. But here's the difference is it made the doctors compete for their business. So if you look at the healthcare system in the US, the only two specialties in which there's anything similar to the free market would be cosmetic surgery and LASIK surgery. And if you look there over the last 20 years, prices have dropped dramatically where and quality has gone up. And that's because the doctors have to compete. So you go to one LASIK doctor, you have an appointment, he gives you a price, you don't like it, so you go to another LASIK surgeon and she gives you a different price and you say, "Okay, I'd rather go to this one." And that's the way free market works. That's how you buy a car. You go to one dealership, then you go to another dealership, and maybe you go online and you get the most that you can get for your money. Same with buying a computer, groceries, gasoline, and everything. So why shouldn't it be that way for healthcare? And by having the doctors compete against each other, then they have to start worrying about price. But right now, under our system, nobody worries about price. And I mean, I've got other examples as well, but I would like to definitely make the comment that one of the problems is we hear politicians say, well, the free market doesn't work, so we're going to have to go to single payer. But actually, we do not have a free market system, and we haven't since at least World War II. So if we did have a free market, then we would see prices go down, just like they have for LASIK surgery and cosmetic surgery, when doctors have to compete and they have to please you to get your business.
All right, so I have one last question, and this has to do with something that was recently posted on your social media accounts, and it is that you have come out in support for the legalization of prostitution. How would you oversee this, and would you allow for the role of a procurer to be legal?
Well, I mean, I don't know what there is to oversee. There is legalized prostitution in parts of Nevada. So, and what we've seen there is a lower transmission rate of STDs. In fact, there's almost almost no transmission of STDs. You don't see pimps beating up on the women. You don't see sex trafficking. What you see are people engaged in a voluntary business, just like buying tobacco or alcohol, or just like if you want to compare it to a service. And I chose tobacco and alcohol because usually drugs are lumped in with that. But if you want to compare it to a service, it'd be like, for instance, if you pay somebody to cut your hair, it's just another service that you and the other person agree to on a price and agree to on terms. And why should the government get involved since it's not a crime to begin with, since there is no victim?
All right. Well, that's all the questions we have today. Would you like to take a moment to speak directly to the audience?
Oh, I thank you. I would appreciate that. So, to any Democrats who are watching or listening, rather, I would like to point out that the Democratic Party traditionally has been the party of peace, anti war, free speech, and that's not the case anymore. Tulsi Gabbard tried her best to spread her message of peace, and she was shot down by the party leaders. And I would like to point out that the Libertarian Party has been the party of peace since the 1970s, and we continue to be the party of peace. In fact, one of my issues is to turn America into one giant Switzerland, armed and neutral, and bring all of our troops home. And to the Republicans, I would point out that, I understand why you voted for Donald Trump because you wanted somebody different. You didn't want another politician. And yet he gets into office on the promise of getting rid of the deficit, and yet the deficit continues to grow. So if you want somebody who does think outside of the typical political box, look into my campaign, and you can check me out at joj2020.com. And I'd like to point out that we have had so many volunteers. We couldn't believe it, and we're really excited by how many non-libertarian volunteers have signed up. And that's rare to see in a campaign this early. So we are getting the message out. There are 40 to 45 million libertarian leaning voters who just don't know about us or haven't checked us out. So please check us out at joj2020.com and please vote for us in the fall.
All right, that's all we have for you guys today. If you'd like to support Dr. Jorgensen's campaign, the link to her website as well as her social media will be down in the description. Thank you all so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.